The rain had been falling for 3 days without pause, soaking every inch of the sleepy college town of Ashford, Virginia. The gutters overflowed. Pavement stones wept dark tears under the heavy, stubborn sky. It seemed the whole world was sagging, surrendering to the weight of something unseen. Ethan Carter trudged along the cracked sidewalk, his sneakers squelching with every step, a battered blue backpack slung over one shoulder. His jacket, thin and fraying at the cuffs, did little to shield him from the damp chill that gnawed at his bones. At 24, Ethan carried more than textbooks and medical manuals. He carried the debts of a mother who had passed too soon, the crushing hopes of a grandmother who still whispered prayers into her coffee each morning, and the relentless clock ticking down on his tuition. He carried, too, the quiet, corrosive fear that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't going to make it. As he crossed the intersection of Elm and Vine, dodging a speeding delivery truck, his phone buzzed in his jeans pocket, startling him out of the hopeless spiral of his own thoughts. He almost didn't answer, but something, instinct, fate, or simple exhaustion, made him pick up. Ethan Carter speaking. The voice on the other end was polished, deliberate, like a scalpel, sliding across silk. Missed. Carter, this is Vivian Kingsley. I'd like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation. Ethan stopped in his tracks, rain dripping from the ends of his hair into his collar. I'm sorry, he said cautiously, shifting under the weight of suspicion. Who are you? How do you even know? I know enough, she interrupted, the words sharp enough to cut the fog between them. Meet me at the Ivy Lounge. 8 o'clock. Don't be late. It's important. Before Ethan could respond, before he could so much as stammer a protest, the line went dead, leaving only the buzz of rain and static humming in his ear. He stared at the screen. Unknown number. No voicemail. No explanation. For a long moment, Ethan simply stood there, letting the rain pool around his worn-out sneakers, the world blurring at the edges. How could she know about his debts? About the eviction notices tucked into his textbooks? About the emergency hospital bills that arrived like clockwork for his grandmother's treatments? The streetlight flickered. A bus roared past, spraying muddy water over the curb. He should go home, he thought. Forget it. Stay away. Instead, slowly, mechanically, he turned toward the Ivy Lounge, the only upscale cafe in Ashford, a place he had only ever glimpsed from the outside, its warm windows promising a world he couldn't afford. The Ivy Lounge sat like a jewel amid the crumbling bricks of downtown, all polished brass, dark wood, and soft golden light. Inside, well-dressed patrons murmured over tiny porcelain cups, the clink of silverware blending with the low hum of jazz from hidden speakers. Ethan pushed open the heavy oak door, instantly drenched in warmth and the rich aroma of roasted coffee and aged leather. Heads turned briefly, assessing, dismissing, before returning to their conversations. He didn't belong here. He knew it. And yet, here he was. At a corner table by the window she sat, Vivian Kingsley, as if the storm outside had bowed to her authority and stopped at the threshold. She was impeccably composed, silver hair swept into a low chignon, a tailored emerald suit that caught the light with every measured breath she took. There was no jewelry, no unnecessary ornament. Wealth, she understood, did not need to shout. Vivian's eyes, sharp, cold, impossibly blue, found Ethan immediately. She gestured to the seat across from her without rising. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice like glass sliding over ice. Sit. Something inside Ethan recoiled, but his legs obeyed. He lowered himself into the chair, acutely aware of the raindrops still clinging to his sleeves, of his damp sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floors. Vivian regarded him over the rim of a delicate porcelain cup. You're struggling, she said. Drowning, actually. Ethan flushed. I'm managing. A slight, almost imperceptible smile curved her lips. The kind of smile that knew things you hadn't yet admitted to yourself. Denial is an expensive indulgence, she said smoothly, setting her cup down. You're in debt. Your grandmother's medical bills are growing. Your scholarships are exhausted. You're a semester away from being forced to drop out. Ethan swallowed hard. How? I have my ways. She cut him off, not unkindly. And I have a proposition for you. There was a pause, the kind of pause that fills a room with invisible smoke. Vivian leaned forward slightly, the soft scent of jasmine trailing after her. Marry me, she said, as calmly as if she were ordering another cup of tea. Ethan stared at her, sure he had misheard. Sure the rain outside had warped the words as they entered his ears. Excuse me, you heard me. This is not about romance. It's a contract. You will be my legal husband. I will eliminate your debts, secure your future, and ensure your family's comfort. In return, you will provide your name, your presence, and your silence. Ethan laughed. A short, incredulous sound. You're serious, he said, half a question, half a plea. Vivian's smile did not waver. Deadly, he looked down at his hands, hands that trembled ever so slightly under the linen-draped table. Why me? He asked finally. You don't even know me. Vivian's gaze sharpened. Exactly. You are young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider what others would not. I don't need love, Miss Carter. I need a companion. I need control over my estate. I need continuity. Ethan's heart hammered painfully against his ribs. This is insane, he whispered. Vivian tilted her head slightly, her silver hair gleaming under the soft lights. Perhaps. But sometimes, she said, her voice dropping to a purr, insanity is just practicality wearing a different face. They spoke for another 20 minutes, or perhaps it was an hour. Ethan would not later be able to say. When he finally stood, the world outside was darker still. The rain was a steady drumbeat against the windows. The future has a heavier weight against his shoulders. Vivian's parting words followed him out into the storm. Think carefully, Miss Carter. Opportunities, real ones, rarely knock twice. That night, in the dim kitchen of the small apartment he shared with his grandmother, Ethan sat at the worn oak table, hands pressed together as if in prayer. Across from him, Martha Carter nursed a mug of tea, her gnarled hands trembling slightly from the cold and the chemo. Ethan explained, haltingly, what had been offered to him. When he finished, the silence was vast, the kind of silence that wraps around you, that fills your lungs when you forget how to breathe. Finally, Martha spoke, her voice soft but unyielding. It's not about what you want, Ethan. It's about what you can live with. He stared at her, the knot in his chest pulling tighter. You're asking me to marry a stranger, a woman almost 3 times my age. For money? Martha's eyes glistened, but she did not cry. I'm asking you, she said, to survive. Outside, the rain never stopped, and deep in Ethan Carter's chest, something shifted, something that would not shift back. The next morning, the rain had softened into a mist, but Ashford still wore its grey like a second skin. Ethan stood at the window of the tiny living room, watching water bead and slide down the cracked glass. Behind him, the apartment buzzed with small signs of life, his grandmother boiling water for oatmeal, the radio whispering an old Ella Fitzgerald tune. Yet in Ethan's chest, there was only stillness, a heavy, deliberating kind of stillness, like standing before a cliff and wondering if you were meant to fall or fly. He turned away from the window. His mind kept replaying Vivian Kingsley's offer, her cool certainty, her unapologetic terms. Marry me, clear your debts, secure your future. It sounded transactional, clinical, but was it survival or surrender? Martha, sensing the storm inside him, simply touched his arm as he passed. Whatever you choose, Ethan, she said. Choose it for yourself, not for guilt, not for fear. He didn't remember walking to the ivy lounge. Only the sensation of the mist soaking through his thin hoodie, and the steady drum of his heart pounding louder than the traffic. Inside, the same warm light embraced him, but this time it felt like a trap disguised as comfort. Vivian was already there. She didn't rise to greet him. She didn't need to. She was dressed today in a slate-grey suit, understated but lethal, like the final word in an argument you didn't know you were having. Without looking up from the tablet resting before her, she said, "You've decided." It wasn't a question. Ethan pulled out the chair, sat, felt the trap closing, delicate and irreversible. "I'll do it," he said. Vivian set the tablet down with a faint click, her hands folding gracefully atop it. There was no triumph in her smile, only something colder, something like inevitability. "Good. We'll arrange the necessary paperwork immediately." In the days that followed, Ethan moved through a strange haze. Vivian's lawyers called. Papers arrived, thick with legal jargon and stipulations, confidentiality clauses, prenuptial agreements, property rights. Everything was ordered, efficient, inescapable. There were no engagement announcements, no champagne toasts, no smiling photographs, only signatures and deadlines and the hollow scrape of a pen across paper. At night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the peeling ceiling of the apartment, listening to his grandmother's soft coughs down the hall. He tried to imagine what his mother would have said. She would have fought it, he thought, fought it until the walls caved in. And yet, wasn't that the problem? Fighting had cost her everything. Maybe survival wasn't about fighting. Maybe survival was about endurance. The morning of the ceremony arrived quietly, without fanfare. No tuxedo, no grand church, no guests. Just Ethan, stuffed into a dark blue suit Vivian had arranged for him, sharp, expensive, and fitting a little too tightly at the throat, standing in front of a county judge, whose face already blurred in his memory. Vivian wore a tailored navy dress. Simple, elegant, timeless. There were no flowers, no vows, no rings, just an exchange of paperwork, just the binding of names. When the judge finally declared them husband and wife, Ethan heard the words without feeling them. They clung to the air like the mist outside, persistent, unavoidable. Vivian turned to him, offering her hand. He took it, cold and dry on his own. "Welcome to your new life, Miss Carter," she said. There was a strange glint in her eyes. Not quite victory, not quite satisfaction. Something darker. Something that made the hair on Ethan's arms rise under the fine wool of his suit. As they stepped out of the courthouse into the silver drizzle, Ethan caught his reflection in a puddle by the curb. The young man, staring back at him, was a stranger. The same brown eyes, the same dark hair, plastered to his forehead by rain, and yet a stranger. A man who had sold something he could not name, for a price he was only beginning to understand. The ride to Kingsley Manor was silent. The driver, an expressionless man in a black cap, did not speak unless spoken to, and Ethan had no words left in him. They passed old brick storefronts and sagging telephone poles, and then, gradually, the landscape changed. Brick gave way to wrought iron, telephone poles gave way to manicured hedges, and finally, at the end of a long, winding driveway lined with ancient oaks, the mansion rose into view. Kingsley Manor. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum, a monument to something already lost. Marble columns soared skyward. Wide stone steps led to a pair of massive carved doors. Ivy clawed up the sides like grasping fingers. Windows, dozens of them, glinted under the pale sky, and yet none seemed to invite light. Vivian stepped out of the car without hesitation, nodding to the staff who materialized like phantoms to retrieve their luggage. Ethan followed, feeling small beneath the looming weight of the building. Inside, the air was cool and dry, scented faintly of cedar and something older, something harder to name. Vivian's heels clicked sharply against the marble as she led him through a grand foyer, dominated by a sweeping staircase. On the walls, oil paintings of long dead Kingsleys watched in silence. Vivian turned briefly, her expression unreadable. "You'll find your quarters upstairs, to the left. Dinner is at 7. Punctuality is expected." Ethan nodded mutely, his throat tight. He followed a silent housekeeper up the sweeping staircase. His suitcase, the only thing he owned now that wasn't entangled in Vivian's contract, rattled behind him. The room assigned to him was beautiful in the cold, distant way of a museum exhibit. A massive bed dominated the space, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked gardens trimmed with merciless precision. An antique writing desk stood by the fireplace, its surface gleaming with a recent polish. But there were no photographs, no clutter, no sign that anyone had ever lived here, or ever would. Ethan dropped his backpack onto the bed. For a long moment, he stood in the center of the room, rain misting the windows beyond, the silence pressing against him like a second skin. He realized, with a slow, painful clarity, that he had not entered a marriage. He had entered a contract, a transaction, a gilded cage. And somewhere deep in the marrow of his bones, Ethan Carter knew the rain hadn't stopped. It had just moved inside. The sun never truly rose the next morning. Instead, a bruised grey light filtered through the windows of Kingsley Manor, dim and listless, as if even the day itself hesitated to set foot inside. Ethan sat at the edge of the massive bed, buttoning the crisp white shirt laid out for him. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender and starch. Impersonal, prepared. He moved mechanically as if he was still trapped inside a dream he hadn't consented to, or perhaps not a dream at all, but something colder, a calculation made real. Today was the formal signing ceremony at the estate, a private affair meant to finalize the last few legal threads of the marriage contract. Vivian Kingsley insisted on precision in all things, and today Ethan Carter would learn just how precise and how permanent her version of a husband truly was. The drawing room was a study in old wealth, dark paneled walls, gleaming mahogany furniture, heavy velvet curtains drawn tightly against the dreary light outside. Vivian waited at a long oak table, already impeccably composed in a deep charcoal dress, her silver hair pinned back like a crown. Two men, her personal attorney and a notary public, stood by her side, briefcases snapped open, documents neatly stacked. Ethan hesitated at the threshold. Vivian's eyes flicked to him, a small, deliberate glance, and he understood. "Come in, sign your name, seal your fate." He crossed the room, feeling the weight of 100 invisible eyes, portraits on the walls, the past watching. Vivian didn't smile. She simply gestured toward the chair beside her. "Miss Carter," she said smoothly. "Shall we begin?" It took less than an hour. Sign here, initial here, agree here, clause after clause, line after line. The ink bound him to a future that no longer entirely belonged to him. The notary's pen scratched across the paper, like the whisper of a guillotine. At the end, Vivian placed her hand lightly over his. It was the first time she had touched him, outside of formal necessity. "Congratulations," she said, her voice low and without inflection. "You're now a Kingsley." Ethan looked down at the simple platinum band she slid onto his left ring finger. It felt heavy, foreign, like a manacle disguised as a promise. That evening, dinner was served in the formal dining hall, a cavernous room with a table long enough to seat 30 guests. Though tonight there were only 2, Vivian sat at one end. Ethan sat at the other, the empty chairs between them, stretched like a canyon carved by time and secrets. Candles flickered in massive silver holders. The food, prepared by unseen hands, was immaculate. Roasted duck, glazed with honey and herbs, truffled risotto, and gleaming fruits arranged in impossible symmetry. But every bite tasted like ash in Ethan's mouth. Vivian ate with surgical precision. Every movement was economical and practiced. She barely looked at him. "You'll find life here runs on a schedule," she said, sipping from a crystal glass of water. "Breakfast at 8, lunch at 1, dinner at 7. Punctuality, Mr. Carter, is not a courtesy. It is a requirement." Ethan nodded stiffly. He could feel the mansion itself breathing around him, a slow, patient inhale, as if measuring his worth. Halfway through the meal, Ethan broke the silence. "You didn't mention much about your late husband." Vivian's knife paused mid-cut. For a moment, the only sound was the soft crackle of the fireplace. She set her utensils down with precision, dabbing at her mouth with a linen napkin. "He was a man of ambition," she said finally. "Not unlike your mother." There was an edge to her words, a blade so sharp it was almost invisible. Ethan felt it cut, though he didn't understand why. Their paths crossed. Vivian continued, her tone casual but weighted, and as you might imagine, not all encounters end well. Later that night, Ethan wandered the halls of the manor. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that magnified every creak of floorboards, every sigh of the old walls. Portraits lined the corridors, stern-faced men in dark suits, women in somber gowns, and children with solemn, haunted eyes. All Kingsley, he assumed, all gone now, save for Vivian, as he passed a locked door at the end of a narrow hallway. Something, a whisper of intuition, brushed against the back of his mind. The brass handle gleamed under the faint moonlight, filtering through the high windows. Ethan reached out and tested it. Locked. He moved on, but the unease remained, a low thrum beneath his ribs. In the coming days, the pattern solidified. Breakfast, isolation. Lunch, silence. Dinner, Vivian's polite, glacial conversation, small talk stitched together with invisible barbs. Staff moved like ghosts, avoiding his eyes, speaking only when spoken to. Doors remained locked. Phone calls were monitored. The manor was beautiful, and it was a prison. Ethan began to realize he was not a husband. He was a piece of furniture, a legal name stitched to a fading empire, and somewhere, deep within the maze of stone and velvet and marble, lay a secret that had nothing to do with companionship, and everything to do with control. Each night, as he lay in the cavernous bed staring up at the cracked plaster ceiling, Ethan Carter asked himself, "How deep does this go? And what exactly have I married into?" The rain continued outside, endless and patient. Inside Kingsley Manor, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that no umbrella could shield against. The days folded into each other inside Kingsley Manor, indistinguishable in their hollow perfection. Every morning, a silent maid left fresh clothes outside Ethan's door. Every meal arrived on the dot, prepared with exquisite skill, but carrying no warmth. Every hallway stretched endlessly, lined with the stares of long-dead ancestors whose oil-painted eyes seemed almost to follow him. And always, always, there were the locked doors, doors that gleamed in the dim light, their brass handles polished but unmoving, doors that seemed, somehow, heavier than wood and iron should ever be. Ethan counted them, as if by mapping them, he could anchor himself against the rising tide of unease. There were 6 on the second floor, 4 more on the third. Each door was a question no one dared to answer. It wasn't just the doors, it was the way the staff moved, quick, precise, careful never to linger. It was the way conversations stopped when Ethan entered a room, as if someone had thrown a switch. It was the way Vivian watched him, always with polite detachment, like a scientist observing a slow experiment. And then there were the whispers, Faint, fleeting, the sort you might mistake for the house settling, if not for the unmistakable snatches of words carried by the draughty corridors. Why him? She never chooses without a reason, poor boy. He doesn't even know yet. One evening, after a strained dinner where Vivian discussed the stock market with the same inflection she might reserve for commenting on the weather, Ethan wandered into the Manor's vast library. Rows upon rows of old books, their leather spines cracked with age, towered around him. The scent of aged paper and binding glue filled the air, thick and heavy. Vivian rarely came here, preferring the colder formality of her office. Ethan ran his fingers along the shelves, letting the textures ground him, when something caught his eye: Vivian's desk. For all its orderliness, carelessness tonight, a folder left slightly askew, a desk drawer was left just slightly ajar, and there, half hidden beneath a stack of monogrammed stationery, a key, small, ornate, silver, with an intricate twisting design that caught the low lamplight and threw it across the wood in curling shadows. Ethan's heart lurched. He looked over his shoulder. The library was silent, except for the quiet tick of a grandfather clock. His fingers closed over the key. It was colder than he expected, as if it had been waiting for him. That night, Ethan lay in his bed, turning the key over and over in his hands. Its weight was disproportionate to its size, as if it carried more than just metal. It carried permission, it carried risk, and somewhere, deep in the marrow of his bones, Ethan Carter knew this key wasn't just for unlocking doors, it was for unlocking truths. The mansion was a labyrinth of quiet when Ethan rose from the bed, barefoot and shivering, despite the heavy robe he pulled around himself. The key pressed against his palm as he crept through the hallways, his steps muffled against the thick Persian rugs, down the east wing, past the double parlor, past the portrait of Vivian's father, who stared down at him with thinly veiled disapproval, and there, at the far end, the door, one he had tested before, locked. Silent. Now he knelt before it, heart hammering against his ribs. The key slid into the lock with a soft, almost eager click. Ethan hesitated. 1,000 warnings whispered through his mind, but curiosity and something deeper, something closer to survival, propelled him forward. The room beyond smelled of dust and old sorrow. Furniture covered in white cloths loomed like forgotten ghosts. The wallpaper peeled at the corners. The air was stale, heavy with secrets. Photographs lined a side table. Silver frames, tarnished but intact. Vivian, younger, a man beside her, tall, handsome, eyes kind, her late husband, and in another frame, a younger woman, laughing in the sunlight. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was his mother. At the old writing desk by the window, yellowed papers lay scattered. Ethan's hands shook as he picked them up, scanning page after page. Business agreements, lawsuits, accusations. Vivian's late husband and Ethan's mother had once been entangled in a bitter legal battle, a battle that ended in the ruin of the Kingsley fortune and the death of Vivian's husband by heart failure. And now, decades later, Vivian had married the child of her enemy, not for love, not for companionship, for revenge. At the center of the desk, a single document lay waiting, a marriage license, signed, sealed, Vivian Kingsley, Ethan Carter, and beneath it, in a different hand, sharper, angrier, a scrawled note: I will take everything from him, just as his family took everything from me. The door creaked behind him. Ethan spun around, heart slamming into his throat. Vivian stood, framed in the doorway, the dim hall light casting her shadow across the faded carpet. Her expression was unreadable. Her voice, when it came, was low and dangerous. Enjoying yourself? Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. Vivian stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded far louder in the silence. Curiosity, she said, gliding toward him, is a dangerous trait, Mr. Carter. He clutched the papers instinctively to his chest. Why? He demanded, his voice hoarse. Why drag me into this? Vivian's eyes were colder than the winter rain. Because you are your mother's son, she said simply. And debt, she added, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her sleeve, is a family trait. The words echoed in the stale, dust-laden air. Because you are your mother's son. Vivian's voice carried no anger, no passion, only the finality of a judge passing sentence. She stood mere feet from Ethan, the flickering light catching in the sharp planes of her face, making her seem carved from marble, a monument to old wounds and colder intentions. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, without another word, Vivian turned on her heel and disappeared down the corridor, her footsteps muffled against the heavy rugs. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Ethan alone in the room. Time had forgotten. He turned back to the desk, breathing hard. The marriage license still trembled in his hands. Beneath it, partially hidden under a faded map of the estate, he found something else, an old, cracked leather journal. Its spine was worn, its pages yellowed at the edges. The initials, VK, were embossed on the cover, barely visible anymore. Ethan hesitated, heart hammering. If there was ever going to be truth in this house, it was in here. Slowly, he opened the journal. The handwriting inside was neat and deliberate, but tightened in places where the words pressed harder into the paper, as if rage had leaked through the ink. The earliest entries were mundane, notes about charity events, property transactions, and society dinners. But as the pages turned, the tone darkened. Vivian wrote of her husband's collapse, after losing everything in the real estate scandal, of watching him wither under the shame, of burying him in a rainstorm, so much like the one Ethan had walked through to reach her, of her hatred for the woman she blamed, the woman who had once been her friend, Ethan's mother. And then the final entries, chilling in their clarity, frightening in their calculation. They left me nothing but a name and a memory. I will not let it end this way. Their legacy will become my prison unless I destroy it first. I will take the son as they took my husband. I will bind him, own him, erase him. And when I am gone, he will carry my mark forever. Ethan closed the journal with trembling hands. The room around him, the dust, the faded photographs, the heavy curtains, seemed to lean closer, suffocating. Vivian hadn't married him out of loneliness. She had married him out of vengeance. He wasn't a husband. He wasn't even a person to her. He was a debt payment, flesh and blood collateral for crimes he hadn't committed. Ethan stumbled from the forgotten room, the journal clutched to his chest like a talisman. The hallway seemed to spin around him, the portraits sneering from their frames. He made it back to his quarters, locking the door behind him. Only then did he allow himself to collapse against the bed, sliding to the floor. The key still burned cold in his pocket. The ink of Vivian's journal seemed to bleed into his hands, and for the first time since stepping into Kingsley Manor, Ethan understood. He wasn't living a new life. He was living someone else's revenge fantasy, and it had only just begun. Later that night, sleep eluded him. He sat by the window, watching the rain lace the glass with trembling lines. Vivian's voice whispered in his memory, over and over, "Debt is a family trait." But if she thought he would simply accept it, if she thought he would wear the chains she forged for him without protest, she had underestimated something vital, something she had never been able to see: resilience, fire, the stubborn, reckless hope that lived in him, despite everything, the same traits that had once made his mother impossible to destroy. The door to his room rattled softly at one point. A test, a warning, a reminder that Vivian owned the house, the rules, and, by legal contract, but Ethan didn't move, didn't open the door, didn't speak. Instead, he sat perfectly still, the rain tracing maps across the window, mapping a way out he had yet to find. Somewhere in the labyrinth of Kingsley Manor, Vivian waited, not for apologies, not for rebellion. She waited for Ethan to crumble, to accept the cage with gratitude. But Ethan Carter, for all his debts, for all his mistakes, for all the paper-thin lines that divided duty from survival, was not ready to be erased. Not yet. The next morning, the rain had finally stopped, but the sky over Ashford remained the colour of old pewter, thick and heavy, as if it mourned something it could not name. Inside Kingsley Manor, however, the storm was just beginning. Ethan dressed carefully, his every movement deliberate and measured. He wore a charcoal suit from the wardrobe Vivian's staff had provided, the fabric whispering against his skin like a warning. Every thread felt like it belonged to her, a soft reminder of ownership stitched into every seam. The journal was hidden, wrapped tightly inside his mattress, beyond where casual searchers would find it. The key he kept around his neck now, strung on a cord beneath his shirt. Small acts of defiance, tiny rebellions. But rebellion, he knew, had a cost, and soon Vivian would demand her payment. Breakfast was a ritual in the manor, a silent chess game played over silver service and imported teas. Vivian sat at the head of the long table, her posture impeccable, her icy blue gaze sharper than any blade. Ethan took his place opposite her. Their conversation, if it could be called that, was limited to the most sterile topics: the weather, the state of the market, the quality of the chef's soufflé. But beneath the surface of each word, a second conversation buzzed. What do you know? What are you planning? How much longer will you stay obedient? Vivian's smile was pleasant. Her eyes were calculating. Ethan met her gaze and smiled back, and wondered if she could see the war gathering behind his teeth. By mid-afternoon, Vivian called for him. He found her in the conservatory, a soaring glass room tangled with dying ivy and pale winter roses. She was pruning a withered shrub, the silver shears flashing like tiny guillotines in her hands. Without looking up, she spoke. "You've been exploring." It was not a question. Ethan's hands curled into fists inside his pockets. "It's a large house," he said evenly. "Hard not to." Vivian clipped a brown stem clean off the rosebush. "Curiosity is natural," she said, "but dangerous. Especially here." She turned, finally meeting his eyes across the dappled sunlight. "This house," she continued softly, "was not built on trust. It was built on loyalty. Blind loyalty." Ethan swallowed back the thousand things he wanted to say, about contracts signed under false pretenses, about vengeance disguised as legality, about the rot at the heart of everything she had created. Instead, he only nodded. Vivian smiled, that faint, closed-lipped smile that always made his skin crawl. "Good," she said, laying the shears on the table. "Loyalty will serve you well, Mr. Carter." And just like that, the conversation was over, or at least the part spoken aloud. That night, Ethan paced his room, heart hammering. He knew now, Vivian wasn't simply content to trap him in marriage. She wanted his obedience. She wanted him to disappear, not physically, but piece by piece, until nothing remained of Ethan Carter, except the Kingsley name he carried like a scar. He needed a way out, not just for himself, for his grandmother too, the woman he'd sworn to protect. The thought of Martha hunched over her radio, waiting for news that would never come, fueled a new kind of rage inside him. A clean, burning anger, not reckless, not wild, focused, cold, dangerous. He needed help, someone he could trust. That night, under the pretense of taking a walk through the grounds, Ethan slipped through the garden gate. and used the burner phone he had hidden in the sole of his shoe, a trick he had learned during his brief internship at a legal aid clinic. It rang twice before the familiar voice answered. "Carter? Man, you fell off the face of the earth. You alive?" It was Caleb, his closest friend from medical school. Sharp, resourceful, loyal to the bone. Ethan kept his voice low, his eyes scanning the dark hedges around him. "I need your help," he said. "And I need it off the record. You sound like you're in a James Bond movie," Caleb joked. "What's going on?" Ethan hesitated, then told him everything. Not the marriage, not fully, but enough. Enough about contracts, signed under pressure. Enough about locked doors and disappearing freedoms. Enough about a woman who smiled like a queen and moved pawns like a general. Caleb's voice sobered. Immediately. "You signed under coercion. You might have grounds to challenge it, but you'll need evidence. Real ironclad stuff." "I'm working on it," Ethan said, grimly. "I just need time. You're in deeper than you realize." "Man," Caleb warned, "be careful. People who build cages don't like it when the birds try to fly." As Ethan slipped back into the manor, the key cold against his chest, he knew. Vivian suspected him. She was watching, waiting, but she didn't know everything. Not yet. And as long as Ethan had breath left in his body, as long as the fire she tried to crush still burned in his chest, he would not go quietly. End of part 6. We've now escalated the stakes. Vivian tightens control. Ethan starts to secretly rebel. Tension rising steadily. The following days passed under a brittle, manufactured calm. Vivian continued her rituals with mechanical grace. The scheduled breakfasts, the impeccably timed dinners, the subtle but unmistakable surveillance. But Ethan Carter was no longer the same quiet shadow she had married. Inside, he was changing quietly, dangerously. He began to observe everything. The way the head butler, Miss Langston, hesitated before delivering sealed letters to Vivian. The way the maids seemed to vanish whenever Ethan entered certain wings of the house. The way Vivian herself lingered just a little too long near the locked west wing doors. The manor was a living organism, a creature fed by secrets, its veins pulsing with silent agreements and ancient vendettas, and Ethan had learned to move like a ghost through its bones. Each night, he slipped out of his assigned quarters and searched the library, the abandoned solarium, and the storage rooms lined with dust-choked trunks. Every drawer he opened, every hidden nook he discovered, chipped away at the fortress Vivian had built, and with each discovery, a clearer picture formed. Vivian wasn't just protecting her fortune, she was hiding something far worse. One night, hidden among accounting ledgers in a forgotten cabinet, Ethan found it, a second set of financial books, meticulously kept, filled with transactions that Vivian's official records never mentioned. Shell companies, offshore accounts, silent partnerships with developers whose names Ethan recognized from Caleb's whispered warnings. Money moved in strange, dark rivers, money that funded questionable ventures, investments built on lies, fraud, conspiracy, criminal deception. Ethan sat back on the dusty floor, the heavy ledger balanced on his knees. His pulse roared in his ears. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival, hers and his, because if Vivian's empire fell, it wouldn't just crush her, it would bury Ethan too, under lawsuits, under scandal, under the kind of public destruction that erased not just names but entire lives. The next evening, during another staged dinner, Ethan dropped a quiet hint. "Between a bite of cold lamb and a sip of wine," he said, "I was reading about asset protection strategies today. Offshore holdings, shell corporations. Fascinating stuff." Vivian's knife froze mid-slice, just for a heartbeat. Then she continued carving her filet, as if nothing had been said. But Ethan saw it. the tightening of her jaw, the flicker in her eyes. She knew. She knew. He knew. And the game had changed. Later, under the cover of darkness, Ethan called Caleb from the old gardener's shed, a place so forgotten by the household that even the rats had abandoned it. Caleb's voice crackled across the weak signal. "If you have proof of financial fraud," he said urgently, "you're sitting on dynamite. You could get her indicted." "Could," Ethan repeated bitterly. "If I live long enough to hand it over, you need to be smart, Ethan. Build a file. Keep backups. Document everything. And then we burn her world down, inside Kingsley Manor." Vivian Kingsley was playing the long game. But so was Ethan Carter now. Every smile he gave her at breakfast was a dagger hidden behind his teeth. Every polite nod at dinner was a brick removed from the foundation of her empire. He hid copies of the ledger pages in multiple locations, behind loose floorboards, inside hollowed-out books, taped beneath his mattress. If Vivian found one, it wouldn't matter. Others would remain, evidence buried like seeds, ready to grow the moment she thought herself safe. Still, the danger grew thicker around him. Vivian's questions became sharper. "Where did you go this afternoon? Why were you in the East Wing? Who are you writing to?" Ethan answered, each time with measured patience, with half-truths woven so tightly into real ones that even Vivian's forensic instincts found no obvious flaw. But the space between them narrowed each day, and Ethan knew a storm was coming, a final confrontation that would decide everything. Each night, before slipping into restless sleep, Ethan touched the small silver key hanging beneath his shirt. A reminder, a promise. He wasn't here to survive anymore. He was here to win. The morning broke, with a sky as white and brittle as bone. Ethan woke before dawn, the house still heavy with sleep. Today, summoned him one. Today it would end, one way or another. He dressed simply, no tie, no jacket, and tucked the ledger copies into his satchel. Along with the original documents Caleb had helped him legally authenticate. As he moved through the halls, every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot. Vivian was waiting in the grand salon, as always, perfect, immovable. Her eyes flicked to the satchel at Ethan's side, but betrayed nothing. "You wish to speak to me," she said, her voice a blade dulled by politeness. Ethan crossed the room, standing before the grand fireplace where generations of Kingsleys had posed for oil portraits. He pulled out the ledger and placed it gently on the coffee table between them. "I know everything," he said. Vivian tilted her head slightly, studying him like a rare, venomous creature. "Do you?" she murmured. "About the offshore accounts, the shell companies, the hidden investments, the fraud that would bury this estate if anyone found out." Vivian's lips parted slightly, a soft breath, escaping surprise or admiration, or both. "You're more dangerous than you look," she said. "You made me dangerous," Ethan replied evenly. For the first time since he had entered Kingsley Manor, Vivian Kingsley dropped the mask. Her face sharpened, cold and unadorned. "You have no idea what your mother cost me," she hissed. "No idea what I had to become just to survive her betrayal, and how many people had to suffer to make you feel powerful again." Ethan shot back. "How many lies? How many lives?" Vivian rose from her chair, the movement slow and deliberate. "You think you're a hero?" she sneered. "You think exposing me will save you? You'll be buried alongside me." Ethan met her fury with a calm she could not shake. "Maybe," he said, "but I won't live as a ghost inside your walls." At that moment, the heavy front doors banged open. Uniformed officers flooded into the manor, followed closely by Caleb, his expression grim but determined. Vivian turned sharply, her hands curling into fists. "Vivian Kingsley," the lead officer said, voice cold and clear. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud." financial misconduct, and obstruction of justice. Vivian's gaze burned holes into Ethan's skin. "You think you've won," she said, voice shaking with restrained fury. "But revenge," she whispered, stepping forward in handcuffs, "is a cage you never leave." Ethan said nothing as they led her away, only watched the Queen fall from her crumbling throne, watched the empire built on hate collapse into dust. The rain began again as the police car pulled away, soft, steady, washing the blood from old stones. The days after Vivian's arrest unfolded in strange, hollow quiet. Kingsley Manor, once a fortress of secrets and sharp glances, now stood half empty. The servants disappeared. The heavy front doors stayed shut. The walls, which once seemed to listen, now only echoed with their own emptiness. Ethan remained, tied not by contract anymore, but by unfinished business. He sat alone in the grand library, the ledgers and documents spread out before him like battle plans abandoned after a war. There was no satisfaction in victory, no thrill, only the heavy ache of knowing how much had been lost, and how much had been twisted beyond repair. It was Miss Langston, the aging head butler, who delivered the letter. He appeared at the library doorway, his thin frame almost swallowed by the size of the room. Without speaking, he held out an envelope, thick, cream-colored, sealed with wax bearing the Kingsley crest. "She left it for you," Langston said quietly. "Said you'd know when to read it." Ethan hesitated before taking it. The paper was cold against his fingers, heavy, final. He waited until nightfall before opening it. Sitting by the library's massive fireplace, he broke the seal with a shaking hand and unfolded the pages. Vivian's handwriting, so sharp and controlled, filled the letter. "Ethan, I once believed that revenge would cleanse the ruins left behind by your mother. I thought if I could tie you to this house, this name, I could balance the scales of what was stolen from me. I see now. Revenge is its own prison. It consumed me long before you ever stepped through my door. You, Ethan Carter, are not your mother's sins. You are not your family's debts. You are your own. In your stubborn defiance, in your refusal to disappear, you reminded me of what I lost long ago. Hope. I leave Kingsley Manor to you, not as a weapon, but as a blank page. Use it well, or burn it down. Either way, be free. Vivian Kingsley." When Ethan finished reading, he sat in silence for a long time. The fire cracked and popped beside him. The rain tapped softly against the windows. Vivian's words felt less like a confession and more like a plea for someone, anyone, to break the cycle she could not. The next morning, Ethan made his decision. He sold Kingsley Manor. The money paid off every debt left lingering over his family, wiped clean the years of fear and scraping and sacrifice. With the remainder, he founded something new, the Kingsley Carter Foundation for Second Chances, a scholarship fund aimed at students crushed by circumstances beyond their control, not to erase the past, but to build a future beyond it. The day he signed the final paperwork, Ethan stood once more at the gates of the old estate. The marble columns glowed under the pale morning light. He didn't feel sorrow. He didn't feel regret. Only freedom. The kind that doesn't come from revenge, or money, or even survival. The kind that comes from finally choosing your own name. 1 year later, the sky over Ashford was blindingly blue, a color Ethan Carter hadn't realized he missed. No storms, no shadows, just open, endless possibility. He stood behind a simple wooden podium at the dedication ceremony of the Kingsley Carter Foundation. Rows of young students, hopeful, hungry for their futures, filled the small college courtyard. Behind him, a bronze plaque shimmered in the sunlight. The Kingsley Carter Foundation for Second Chances. Because everyone deserves more than just survival. Ethan's voice was steady as he spoke. This isn't just about scholarships. It's not about erasing pain. It's about building something better from the pieces we're given." He paused, letting the words settle into the warm spring air. "We inherit more than names. We inherit burdens, fears, dreams, and sometimes mistakes, but we also inherit the chance to do better." The crowd was silent, listening. Ethan smiled, a quiet, genuine smile he hadn't worn in years. "Here's to second chances for all of us." After the ceremony, as the students and families mingled and laughed, Ethan wandered to the edge of the courtyard. From his pocket, he pulled out a small, battered envelope, Vivian's letter. The one he carried still, not out of guilt, not out of anger, but as a reminder of how far he had come, of the power of choosing forgiveness over vengeance, of what it meant to be free. He looked up at the sky, letting the sun warm his face. The past still lived behind him, as all pasts do, but it no longer chained him, no longer defined him. And as he stepped forward into the crowd, into the future, he knew he was his own man now, and the sky had never looked clearer.